What's going on, guys? My name is Josh Kirchner. Thanks for tuning in to another video on the Dialed In Hunter YouTube channel. Sorry, it's been a little bit since I put out a video. Hunting season started, so I've kind of been all over the place, sleeping in the dirt, soaking up adventure. It's been awesome. Today, though, what I wanted to talk about is something that I briefly covered in a video I did not too long ago on my backcountry sleep system. And that is going to be the debate between sleeping bags and quilts. Like, what is going to be best for backpack hunting? I'm going to dive into that today, cover the nitty-gritty on both options, and hopefully at the end of this you have a better idea of what might work for you and your backpack hunts. So before we dive into sleeping bags versus quilts and the specifics about each of those, I want to cover some general things that apply to both options. So the first one is going to be down versus synthetic. Okay, you're going to have the options of getting a down bag or a down quilt or a synthetic bag or a synthetic quilt. So pros for down is definitely going to be a lot more ultra light and much more packable. It's going to compress down much better than synthetic will. I also find it to be I just like the feeling of down better. Like when I cuddle up in a down bag or a down quilt or even a down jacket, I just like the feeling of that better. That's just my personal opinion. The downsides of down, though, are going to be moisture. Okay, most of the down that's out there now in the newer bags and newer jackets and stuff like that, it's treated down, so it can handle a little bit of moisture, but I'm telling you, man, once down gets wet, the insulation of down is pretty much useless, and you're kind of SOL if you're out in the field. Another downside of the down is that sometimes those feathers have a tendency to come out of the bag or quilt and poke you. It's not a huge deal, but like, it's kind of annoying when you're laying there and then all of a sudden you turn over and it feels like something stabs you. It's a feather. So that's another downside of down. Not a huge deal, like I said, but just another something else to think about. As far as synthetics go, I don't really use synthetics a whole lot where I live. I live in a very dry climate down here in Arizona, so I don't really have to worry too much about moisture. But if you live somewhere like in the Pacific Northwest, somewhere that is very wet, synthetic is probably going to be a better option for you. It's a little less packable and it's heavier than down, but unlike down, synthetic doesn't lose all of its insulation when it gets wet like down does. So just a plus for that. Synthetic also tends to be, from my experience, more of a durable insulation than down is, which kind of, plays on it's a little bit heavier part of things. So it's really a give and take whether you want to go with down or synthetic, and I really think that choice needs to be a product of your environment and where you're planning on hunting most. And maybe even you have both options if you like to travel and hunt around in different places, so you can kind of cater your sleep system to where you're actually going hunting. Aside from the type of insulation, another thing that you need to think about when choosing a sleeping bag or a quilt is the size. Size does in fact matter. If you have a sleeping bag or a quilt that is too small for you, you are going to compromise the insulation, because basically what happens if it's too tight to your body, the insulation compresses, creating less insulation value. And the opposite can be said, or actually the same can be said for the opposite. If your bag or quilt is too big, now the space inside of the sleeping bag or quilt is greater than it should be, which means that it creates more space that needs to be warmed up. So that can create like cold spots in your bag or quilt, which is going to just inevitably make you sleep not as warm as you would if you had a quilt or bag that was properly fitted to you. So pay attention to that as you're kind of perusing and shopping. Like, these bags and quilts, there's different sizes for a reason, and it's something you absolutely need to pay attention to if you really want to get the most out of your bag or quilt. Lastly, before we get this sleeping bag versus quilt debate going, I want to touch on temp ratings. So this is a really frustrating topic because not all temp ratings are created equal, which is super frustrating for if you're out there trying to find the right quilt or bag for you, that you need to pay attention to stuff like that. You'd think it'd be like a, you know, one and done kind of scenario, but it's really not. In general, when a bag or quilt says, oh, this is a 20-degree bag, right? Generally that means that you're gonna stay alive down to 20 degrees, but you're gonna be comfortable to probably 30 degrees. Now, like I said, not all temp ratings are created equal. There's companies that really hold a high standard and announce their temp ratings, and those temp ratings are actually very accurate. You know, companies like Western Mountaineering and stuff, these higher end companies, Feathered Friends is another one. Those temp ratings are pretty accurate, and you don't have to worry about, like, if it's a 20-degree bag, getting below 30 degrees and not being warm. So just a general kind of idea when looking at bags and quilts in terms of temp ratings, most companies, from my experience, there's like that 10-degree buffer. You can go for the higher end stuff, which is really pricey. It's worth it, but it's really pricey, and those temp ratings are going to be much more true to size, if that makes sense. Something else to pay attention to, and by the way, what I'm talking about with temp ratings, like, you can find out from reviews on bags and quilts, certain bags and quilts from people that have used them. You can contact the company and they will tell you, you know, oh, this is the comfort rating and this is the, you know, you're not gonna die rating. You can call them up and ask them about that, or email them. The other thing though is there's different ratings for men versus women, okay? Men sleep warmer than women do. So women temp ratings are going to be different than men temp ratings. So keep that in mind, okay? If you're a gal and you're trying to buy a sleeping bag that has a men's temp rating of 20 degrees, that might mean the temp rating for you might be 30. Okay, so you might not actually only be comfortable down to 40 degrees rather than the 30 degrees that would be the comfort rating for a man. So keep that in mind. Okay, all that aside, let's dive into sleeping bags versus quilts. All right, sleeping bags. Let's start with the most common option that people are most familiar with. Sleeping bags are a fantastic option for backpack hunting. There's really good options out there. A few pros of sleeping bags are, one, there's way more options to choose from than quilts. Far more companies have more options available for sleeping bags, and which just, you know, helps you tailor your purchase to your own style and your budget, for that matter. So that's a pro of sleeping bags. Another pro is, at least the mummy bags, there's a hood, okay? Now, I don't necessarily, some people use the hood as an actual hood and they put it on their head. That's awesome. I don't really do that. What I really like the hood for is putting my pillow in it, okay? So you know, I use a Sea to Summit Aeros ultralight inflatable pillow, super comfortable, but I stuff that pillow in the hood of the sleeping bag and it stays put. Okay, if there's no hood there, you're constantly trying to grab your pillow throughout the night, If you turn over, it's going to fall off your pad, and you got to keep doing that throughout the entire night and repositioning your pillow. With a sleeping bag, you don't have to do that because that hood holds the pillow in place. Super nifty. And another pro of sleeping bags is and this will make sense a little bit more when we talk about quilts, but they're much easier to use. They're much more user-friendly than a quilt is, in my opinion, which means that it's easier to get warm. There's no details on how to do that. I'll cover this in a second, but sleeping bags, man, you get in there, you zip them up, you're good to go to sleep. A couple cons to think about with sleeping bags are, one, they are heavier. They're just gonna be heavier by nature than a quilt is. It doesn't matter how high end of a sleeping bag you get. The fact of the matter is a quilt has less material on it than a sleeping bag does. So naturally you're going to have less weight, which means that also a sleeping bag is less packable than a quilt will be, which is another con of a sleeping bag. And lastly, on the con front, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but zippers break, okay? Like zippers break. Things get caught in zippers as you're trying to zip yourself up, which is kind of annoying, especially when it's cold out and you're like, gosh dang it, it's dark, you can't see, something's stuck in the zipper, you can't get yourself all cuddled up in the bag. That is kind of annoying, and definitely what I would consider a con of a sleeping bag. When it comes to quilts, a couple pros of quilts are going to be that, one, we've covered this already, but one, they're more lightweight and they're more packable, okay? Less material. A quilt, you can basically think about a quilt like a sleeping bag without a bottom. And the kind of the science behind a quilt is your sleeping pad is the thing that is going to insulate you from the cold ground, right? Now, when you're in a sleeping bag and you lay down on the bottom part of that sleeping bag, remember what we talked about with size matters, okay? So remember how I said if the insulation is tight and compressed, it devalues the insulation. So the thinking behind a quilt is if that insulation is void, right, and we're using the insulation from our sleeping pad anyways to keep us warm, why have the bottom on the bag? Hence a quilt. So you get this more ultralight, more packable option than you would a sleeping bag. And when compared to a sleeping bag, a quilt is much, much more versatile. Okay, the quilt that I have, Enlightened Equipment Revelation 20 degree quilt, it has a foot box, but I can actually open that foot box up and essentially use it as a blanket. Okay, if it's warmer out, I can throw a leg out. I'm not confined in a mummy type bag. You can sleep a lot more freely. I mean, honestly, pretty much like you sleep at home. You can sleep like you do at home with a quilt on. It's not tied around your body. Your arms aren't squinched in to your sides and stuff. You can kind of sleep however you want in a quilt. So very, very versatile. And then when it gets colder, there is an attachment system for a quilt. And this is where we're going to get into the cons of a quilt. You really need to understand how the attachment system works in order to not get a draft in a quilt. So I'm going to consider this a con, okay? I've heard so many stories about people using quilts and freezing their butts off, and I truly, and like using the same quilt as me, right? And I truly believe it's because they didn't have the quilt attached properly to the sleeping bag, or sorry, to the sleeping pad. If you want, I should probably do a separate video on that. If you want to see that video talking about how to properly attach your quilt to your sleeping pad, let me know down below in the comments, and maybe I'll do a separate video just on that. But just know that you need to figure that out, okay, to mitigate any types of drafts. When done properly, you will not have a draft, okay? So if you're getting a draft in your quilt, something's off, all right? Which is why I kind of feel like sleeping bags are easier to use. There's less details. You just jump in, zip up, you're good to go. With a quilt, there's a little bit more to think about. Something else to think about with quilts that is a downside if you're dead set on getting a quilt is there's just not as many options of quilts out there as there are sleeping bags. There's great options. Enlightened Equipment makes a great quilt. Catabatic makes a great quilt. I know there's some other ones out there. Let me know down below if you have another one that you really like. Let me know what quilt you're using down below. But there's just not as many options. So you can't, in my opinion, you can't like, it's harder to match what you need with your budget when compared to a sleeping bag, because there's so many options out there for a sleeping bag. And another thing, this is more of a personal thing for me, but I mean, maybe you feel this too. The quilt doesn't have the hood that I talked about with the sleeping bag. So, you know what, man? I just got back from an elk hunt. I was using a quilt. It worked great, but every single time I turned over on my pad, I would have to loosen the cinch around my neck here, reach my arm out, grab my pillow, and put it where I needed it to go, because every time I moved, my pillow would fall off of my sleeping pad. So like not a deal breaker, but it's just, you know, like on backpack hunts, the details matter, you know what I mean? And that's a detail that I've noticed through the years of using both a sleeping bag and a quilt. All of that begs the question, is a sleeping bag better or is a quilt better? Okay. At the end of the day, you're the only one that can answer that, because you're not hunting and backpack hunting in the same stuff that I am. But I'll tell you how I run both, and maybe that can help you out. So in the earlier part of the season, I'm talking, you know, even some spring bear hunts here in Arizona, sometimes they can be warm as you get further into the spring. And then certainly the first part of fall, August, and you know, first half of September, I'm going to run a quilt. I'm going to run my 20-degree quilt. It's going to work great. If for some reason, you know, I'm going to get a cold snap or something like that coming through, which has happened before, especially, you know, hunting in Colorado or something. Sometimes you get a random snowstorm in the beginning or beginning of September, you know what I mean? So I'll bring either a liner with me for the quilt, or I will, you know, maybe just bring an extra layer or two to sleep in. So that's where I will use a quilt. And then after that, I transition to a sleeping bag. Sleeping bag I use is a Feathered Friends Lark UL10. It's a fantastic sleeping bag. I believe it's 900 fill goose down. Very comfortable. The temp rating is true to spec. And that's kind of what I use until the end of January. And then sometimes even into early spring when I go like to Idaho or something like that, where you can certainly get an early spring snowstorm when you're bear hunting. So that's kind of how I run it. Honestly, I know people that run quilts throughout the entire year. Okay, you can certainly get quilts like down into really cold weather, and they're happy. They're happy with that, and maybe that's something that I look into. You know, as a backpack hunter, you're always trying to think about weight and packability. Like, how can I get my backpack lighter? How can I have a little bit more space in my backpack? You know what I mean? More space in the backpack means you can get out for more days, right? But at the end of the day, what is efficiency doesn't necessarily mean less weight and more space in your pack. Efficiency might mean a better night's sleep. And if you sleep better, you feel more secure, you sleep better in a sleeping bag, then that's the right option for you. Don't worry about quilts, right? That's going to do it, guys. My thoughts on sleeping bags versus quilts. I want to know what you think. Drop your experiences down below. I want to know if you're using a sleeping bag or a quilt and why. If you've had good experiences, bad experiences, let's hear it. Let's talk about sleeping bags and quilts down below, and maybe we can all learn from one another. Okay, so if you liked the video, please hit thumbs up. If you like the channel, please hit subscribe. I'm getting ready to go on a bear hunt right now, and I'm so jacked up here in my home state of Arizona. I hope all of your fall seasons are treating you well. Fall hunting season only comes around once a year. I've said this before. Soak it up, enjoy it, and I'm going to see you in the next video.